Morning, everyone. I see people arriving. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes. All right. Yeah, I know it's Zoom. I don't know if anyone else has these issues, but sometimes it takes a while to update before you actually can enter a webinar. But I think just going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss IBO's recently released analysis of New York City's preliminary budget for fiscal year 2025. This includes our independent economic and spending forecasts and a report on the status of the program to eliminate the gap or PEGs. I'm Tina Guarda, IBO's Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer. We'll be answering questions today for about 35 minutes. Please write your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We'll also be sharing some links to our reports for reference in the chat, but the Q&A box is where I'll be looking for questions. This virtual event is being held on Zoom meetings, which has some accessible features. Automated live captions are available by turning on the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. We're joined by Louisa Chafee, IBO's director, as well as Sarita Subramanian and Sarah Parker, our senior research strategy officers. Malik Al-Shamri, our press secretary, who some of you may already know, is also here. And now I'm going to hand it off to our panelists for some brief introductions. And I'll start with IBO's director, Louisa Chafee.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Louisa Chafee. I'm the director of the Independent Budget Office. It's a pleasure to meet with you today. We are here to discuss IBO's response to the preliminary budget or also known as the January plan. And this is one of IBO's mandated reports, one of three mandated by the New York City Charter and central to IBO's mission. So we look forward to sharing with you our findings and analysis. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Parker.
Hello, good morning. So as Louisa mentioned, this is our review of the preliminary budget. IBO in the city charter is tasked with analyzing quarterly budget updates in November, in January, and then the executive plan that comes out in April. And one of the things that we do is an independent economic forecast, and then we do a revenue forecast. And that's really looking at the part of the budget on how much money the city is bringing in. And then we also look at the spending side. So places where we think the city will be delivering services and operating either at a higher cost or lower cost than what's in the budget. And in looking at both revenues coming in, but also spending going out, IBO creates its own measure of what we think the budget gap or surplus will be at each financial plan. So in our analysis of the preliminary budget, IBO is expecting a larger surplus than what the Adams administration is looking for. And this is IBO came out $2.8 billion more than what the administration is expecting in 2024. This is driven by about $900 million more in tax revenue coming in. So IBO has higher expectations for tax revenues than the administration, and this is also coupled with 1.9 billion less in spending than we expect than what's in the budget. Sarita will be covering some of the large differences in our spending estimates. So just to start us off, with a surplus, the city uses any additional money that it has in the current year to prepay expenses for next year. And so with the prepayment, IBO is expecting, with this cushion from this year, plus how we think spending and revenues will play out next year, we're expecting a $3.3 billion surplus in 2025. IBO does expect budget gaps in the year starting in 2026, but these are sort of proportionally within what the city has been able to close historically. So there are going to be budget gaps right now for future years, but we're not at a point where we're raising a caution flag. Very briefly to touch upon our economic and revenue forecasts, IBO largely we look at local economy jobs. We are expecting the city to continue to add jobs. We're estimating around 90,000 new jobs created next year, and this is largely a sort of pattern of the city sees continued economic growth, but it is slowing down. So we're not in sort of a big boom period, but we're not expecting a recession either. And that's translated into our expectations for revenues. So we also see with many of our revenue sources, particularly personal income tax and sales tax tend to be very closely tied with the local economy, and then that a product of sort of the national economic landscape. So again, we expect taxes to continue to grow, but at slowing rates. And of particular note, property taxes in recent years have seen really strong increases in growth rates, and IBO is expecting things to very much slow down on that front. Property taxes being the largest driver of New York City's tax base. I'm gonna pass it off to Sarita now.
Thank you. So Sarah talked about the revenue side of things coming into the city. So I'm going to review some key areas of expenditures that IBO continues to monitor very closely. And so the first category are areas of spending where IBO projects less than what the administration is budgeting for. And that includes for the city workforce, because of vacancies in 2024. The other area where IBO's projections are less than the administration's are in asylum seeker costs. Between 2024 and 2025, IBO's projections for costs are 2.4 billion less than what the administration's budget at the preliminary budget reflects. And finally, another area is lower charter school enrollment projections. And this is largely due to the fact that historically charter school enrollment was increasing pretty steadily, but since the pandemic, that has really tapered off and plateaued. And so our projections are lower than what the administration is budgeting for. Some key areas where IBO anticipates additional expenditures over what the administration predicts include for the City for HEPS program, which is the largest city-funded housing voucher program. And so IBO anticipates additional funds, particularly beginning in 2025. The administration did add additional funds for 2024, but there are more expenditures that we anticipate beginning in 2025 and continuing on. Another area are personnel costs at uniformed agencies, and this is largely driven by overtime costs. So this is an area that we have been monitoring very closely, and it continue to expect additional expenditures, again, beginning in 2025. And then finally, within the Department of Education, there are additional expenditures that IBO anticipates for replacing funding that was previously funded by the federal COVID aid, which is expiring. And so that creates additional expenditures for largely 2026 through 2028
in the preliminary budget. There are other areas within education that include funding to meet the state mandated class size limits, as well as Carter case expenditures. So expenditures for instances where families can place students in private settings and claim reimbursement from the city. Also included in the preliminary budget was the administration's second round of the program to eliminate the gap, or PEGs. And IBO recently released a report looking specifically at the PEGs in the preliminary budget, categorizing them in a couple of different buckets. So first, we looked particularly at areas that received cuts in both the November and the preliminary plans. And we highlighted the fact that many of those areas largely contract with nonprofit organizations for the provision of human services, and this has, real impacts on the delivery of those services and to, humans and the experience of New Yorkers. In areas that include the Department of Education, early childhood programs. Actually, IBO published a separate brief detailing the history of the budget additions and reductions in that area. Programs for justice-involved individuals, including reentry services and mentorship programs, and also older adult centers. We also note decreases in the budgets for Department of Cultural Affairs and also the libraries that also have implications in terms of the organizations that receive funding from the Department of Cultural Affairs and library. Although they didn't receive an additional cut at the preliminary budget, the services have been reduced for Sunday services. And finally, we looked at restoration. So the preliminary budget did include some restorations of cuts from the November plan. A couple of key areas that fall into that category are for the Summer Rising program. That was a partial restoration for this summer. Summer Rising is a joint program between Department of Education and Department of Youth and Community Development, and provides summer programming for about 100,000 elementary and middle school students. Another area was the Parks Opportunity Program, which is a job training program for low-income New Yorkers, and also litter basket service was restored. We have further details in our PEG report, but I will pause there and turn it back over to Tina.
Thanks. So the first question we have is Adams has adjusted his asylum seeker costs since the prelim, correct? Could we get a comparison between IBO's estimate and Adams' revised estimate, which he said eliminated the need for the April PEG?
Yes. So as I mentioned, the difference between IBO's estimate and the administration's estimate has reduced in the preliminary budget compared with what was in the November plan. IBO's estimate from following the November plan did incorporate a reduction in costs, as that was the 20% reduction was announced after the November plan, and IBO's estimate did incorporate lower costs in our December publication. And so the preliminary budget reflects the administration's adjustment for that 20% reduction. And so over the 2024 and 2025 fiscal years, the difference between our estimates is $2.4 billion. There was also an announcement of an additional 10% reduction for asylum seeker costs that IBO anticipates will be reflected in the executive budget in April. So that's something that we will continue to monitor. And we do plan to look at our estimate as well.
And more on the pegs, would it be possible to get a breakdown of peg impacts for DSS, both DHS and HRA? Has DSS been somewhat insulated from pegs?
That's a good question. Let me see. I mean, the one area that I mentioned, I know that is within the DSS budget, a portion of it is the Parks Opportunity Program that was fully restored. I can
We
get back to you on, further details within these particular agencies.
Great. 'Cause another question is, can you talk about whether the administration and OMB acted unusually by not updating its revenue or spending forecasts in its November plan?
So I'll
I'll
take-
take this one.
Great.
So the administration's choice to have a multi-round peg letter and concurrently to not update their forecasts and revenues for the out years did amplify a situation. If you look at the IBO's November response and also the city council's response, you see that the um, our agency and another agency had very similar perspectives as to where the city was from a fiscal position, in contrast to the administration's position. And in fact, the administration, once they updated their information, is far more in line with where we are. So that's what we can say when we talk about it.
Yeah, there was a second question asking about, what we made of the dramatic increase in revenue projections between November and January and whether that was abnormal. But I think, yeah, we've addressed that.
I think we are a nonpartisan, fact-based organization. We're very good at math, and there is consistency in the numbers we put forward.
And I think sort of still a little bit on this topic is based on our revenue estimates. I think some of this we can comment on, some of this we can't. Do we think the previous two pegs were necessary? Is there enough additional revenue to restore them in fiscal year 2025?
Well, it is every administration's choice as to how to allocate any spending or increases and reductions. So it's not our place to determine whether or not pegs were necessary. In other words, we can see from a combination of forecasting and revenues how the budget can be balanced. And we also recognize that the city has other challenges in addition to the pegs. So there is a deep decrease in staffing, not basically stemming from COVID era departures, etc., and also hiring freeze and hiring slowdown, causing operational challenges. So independent of planned and or executed budget reductions or programs to eliminate the gap, there is a general operational impact in government currently going on, which we think also needs to be considered. Sorry, that's my dog making a guest appearance in the background. Excuse me.
Going a little bit more into revenue, can we comment on the future of commercial office space and city property tax revenue?
Yeah, so this has certainly been a topic everyone has been talking about. So what we're seeing specifically, property tax is the largest source of revenue in New York City. There are four sort of buckets that properties can fall into, which are known as tax classes. And the two that largely are driving sort of any increase IBO sees in property tax are your sort of apartment buildings, so large commercial real estate, residential real estate. This is rental buildings, but also co-ops and condos, and then commercial space, which includes, of course, office space. Um, so one thing that we're seeing before the pandemic, commercial office real estate in Manhattan was seeing a sort of growth in its valuation of almost 6% a year. That's now slowing down. IBO is estimating about a 2% growth. So again, it's still gaining value, but at a much slower pace. At some level, long-term leases are in place for many commercial tenants, and we haven't really seen a material drop in commercial office prices that are being commanded. So this is something we're closely monitoring. Certainly, we are not anticipating a complete collapse of the commercial office market. Um, and then lastly, one thing out of all of this discussion about sort of the state of office buildings, they're one segment of commercial space, which includes retail and industrial spaces. Um, and that's one segment of the overall property tax generator. 1 to 3 family houses are very, very sort of predictable and formulaic in terms of the revenue they bring in. And so it's important to know, even in all of this rhetoric about the state of office buildings and where that's going, it's one piece of a much larger picture when it comes to property tax revenues.
Switching tacts here, some questions about the implications for the community schools initiative as described in the prelim. What are the implications?
Sure. So I can talk about that. So at the November plan, there was a peg for the community schools initiative, and there was a partial. Let me explain. The community school initiative provides wraparound services for students in high poverty schools. In the November plan, there was a reduction to that program, and there was a partial restoration for the 2024 year. However, let me just make sure that I'm getting the year right. Yes. However, we do still see a need for additional funding in the out years. We're still trying to get a better understanding of what those reductions could mean in terms of the community-based organizations that contract with the Department of Education to provide those wraparound services.
And continuing on education, can you discuss the impact on early childhood programming a little bit more, according to the prelim? And I know that we have linked we have a link in the chat to our report on this topic.
Yes, so as I mentioned, this was an area that we highlighted both in the PEG report that was released yesterday, as well as a separate report that looked sort of longer term at the budget for early childhood programs. And so this was an area that received a PEG both in the November plan and again at the preliminary budget. IBO also looked back historically at previous budgets, and so also took into account a reduction that happened at the November plan of 2022, so last a year prior to this past November plan. And so taking that all into account, we did see a reduction for the 2024 school year, cumulative reduction across these plans of 283 million. And then for 2025, a reduction of almost 400 million. And so we are still trying to get more clarity around what this reduction will mean in terms of access to early childhood seats for New Yorkers. The administration cites lower enrollment in centers, but we have been in touch with advocates and a lot of other community-based organizations that contract with the city to provide these services. And we have heard that there is a demand for early childhood seats, but a greater demand for greater coverage for families. So families that seek coverage, for longer hours, in addition to the traditional school day, but also full year coverage, so including summer coverage as well. So that's an area that we continue to monitor and try to get better data to try to understand what is the capacity at different sites, what are the types of seats that are available, and then also looking at what families, what sites families are applying for, and how exactly and how and where that mismatch is occurring.
There's another question on operational impact, and it's a request to elaborate a little bit more on issues around service delivery, and whether they're attributed to the admin failing to fill existing vacancies, i.e., is this a hiring problem? The question is, have we gotten to the point where the elimination of vacancies has started to have an impact, or do all agencies still have vacancies to fill, all or most of them?
Louisa, do you want to start?
There is clearly an operational impact, both through the pegs and through the hiring situation, which involves a hiring freeze and a hiring slowdown. And so the easiest way to see that is to look at the mayor's management report, where even a year ago there was clear data on some basic functions. The example that we often point to is the processing of SNAP applications, commonly known as food stamps, and the just remarkable drop in speed of processing of services. Our report really tries to break out, our PEG report really tries to break out where cost savings are impacting agency functions and or agencies' engagement of outside organizations to provide functions versus where there are cost savings by, for example, switching city money for other revenue sources, which is also a standard mechanism of taking a PEG. Have we gotten to the point where the elimination of vacancies has started to have an impact? Yes. And almost all agencies have had reductions in headcount. They may no longer have vacancies to fill because some agencies have relinquished their headcount as part of their PEG plan and or other cost-saving maneuvers, but we see across the board impact. We have gone from a government of some 320,000 employees to some 284,000 employees, starting, and that's basically looking at, I believe, 2015 data till now. I'm asking Sarita to adjust me if I'm wrong on the dates, but a dramatic reduction in headcount, really impacting the city across the board.
And next, changing tracks to a little bit of a different focus. There's a question on, given the peg cuts to the Department of Cultural Affairs, do you know the difference in last year's Cultural Development Fund total grants in dollars and this year's?
Yes, and that was an area that we highlighted in the PEG report. We actually obtained data from the Department of Cultural Affairs on grants to over 1,000 organizations through the Cultural Development Fund, or CDF. And so let me just look at the total dollars there. So we did note that the reductions for the CDF total approximately 7 million across the two plans for 2024, and that's about 11% reduction in the budget. I don't have the total budget in front of me, but I can look that up and add it to the chat. But I think what is really interesting here is that we did look by recipient and found that 80% of this year's recipients received smaller or no awards compared with last year. And then we also looked at recipients based on the size of their awards, and we saw that organizations that received smaller awards in 2023 saw a relatively larger average reduction compared with organizations that received larger awards. So I do encourage you to look at, we have a supplemental Excel file that we provided for more details for particular organizations.
Thank you. And there's a question wanting a little bit more finer detail on and to clarify what we're saying. And so this person wrote, you're saying that the administration's choice, and this is going back to sort of strategy over the pegs, that the administration's choice to move forward with pegs without updating revenue projections in November exacerbated the need for the cuts. So he's asking if that's what our statement on that would be. And in other words, if the administration had updated its revenue projections in November, it might have found it had more money and less need for the pegs.
So I'm going to take this one. If the administration had updated their numbers to reflect what their numbers were in their January, in their preliminary budget, they certainly would have had a more ample fiscal situation. So we do agree with that. What we cannot, pegs are a policy choice by the administration. And so we cannot say that with more money, there might have been less need for pegs. That is the administration's choice. But to be clear, if the administration had done the math that they did in January in the fall, we believe they would have shown a circumstance much closer to what they showed in January. And it would have eliminated the really dramatic difference between their November and their January reports.
On another operational, more of a fiscal management question, what does IBO think of the city's practice of adding funding for items such as overtime and city housing vouchers throughout the year instead of including it in the budget from the start?
Yeah, so I think we IBO has highlighted these areas of expenditures, not just in this preliminary budget, but they are areas that we have been re-estimating for quite some time now. And so I'll start with the City for HEP's housing voucher program. That is an area that is currently budgeted at very low levels, and even just looking at actual expenditures from 2023, IBO estimates substantial additional funding needed, and that is just to maintain the program at the levels that it was funded at in 2023. That doesn't account for any potential expansion of that program as per the local city council local law. And so that is an area that, you know, IBO has been estimating that additional cost, and do believe that that is something that the administration, should factor in, because they are known costs that will need to be reflected. Um, and I would say that similarly for overtime, that is also an area that IBO has anticipated those costs at, and has been reflecting in previous budget analyses as well.
And so to maybe just to be really clear, or to add on to the details, the data shows that the administration, despite indicators from the most recent prior cycle, tends to step down in certain areas and then move up during the course of a fiscal year, even as spend happens, in a way that does not necessarily align with the intentions of transparency and clarity in budgeting.
And with that, I'm going to ask if anyone else has any further questions. If I've missed any, just if you could rewrite them. I don't think I have, but I just want to make sure. Just going to wait like just a little bit. This person said last question. It's okay. You can keep asking questions. Is it common to update revenue projections in November?
So I'm happy to answer this one. There certainly have been sort of many years where OMB generally doesn't do a big update in November. That being said, there have also been examples historically where OMB has done that exercise. And for us, where we sit in IBO, it was sort of an interesting choice not to do that update, while simultaneously uh, calling for what was then 3 rounds of pegs in the next 3 budget plans. Um, IBO, per the charter mandate, does this exercise at November, at the preliminary budget, and at the executive budget. So for us, we are always using the most recent numbers that we have available to us and trying to really get a sense of what we think realistically revenues coming in will be, and then again, spending, realistically what spending will be. And that's sort of tying back to the discussion we just had about places where the budget wildly underfunds um, what spending likely will be in future years. And so all of this, IBO, again, we're just using the best available information to try and really put out a sense of the clearest estimates on what New York City's budget and fiscal health looks like.
And maybe just to add on to what Sarah said, important also to remember that based on executive going into this year, going into the current fiscal year, OMB's estimates were as usual and as consistent with their position, more cautious on the overall economic position of the city. In other words, was a recession going to occur? and or what were the fiscal challenges awaiting the city. The administration was far more cautious last spring, and as they consistently historically are, and one could argue should be, as they are responsible for maintaining a balanced budget. But using that very cautious data again in November amplified a circumstance, and the historical difference perhaps is in the last years, there hasn't been that level of fiscal challenge found between, or fiscal differences found between May and November.
Okay, I don't see any others, so I just want to thank everyone for coming today, and stay tuned. We'll have another press briefing after our analysis of the exec budget. And if you have any questions in the meantime, you can email Malik at press@ibo.nyc.ny.us. Malik can throw that in the chat, but I recognize some of the names, so you may have his contact already. But yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.